So as we mentioned earlier, President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris will be heading to Atlanta, Georgia to advocate for voting rights and push for two new pieces of legislation. They're hoping that Congress will pass the new measures by next Monday's Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. But some critics say the administration is not acting fast enough. Several voting rights and civil rights groups are choosing to skip the president's speech later today. Ed O'Keefe explains why.
We haven't seen the type of leadership that we need to see from President Biden.
Cliff Albright is co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, part of a coalition of Georgia groups that say President Biden shouldn't come to Atlanta without concrete plans to pass voting rights legislation.
What we really want to see, given that he came down here, is that he's got an ironclad deal in place. Anything short of that is really going to be disappointing.
The Biden administration is pushing to pass two new voting rights bills, and the White House says the president today will call upcoming votes on them a turning point in the nation. In his speech, Mr. Biden will vow to defend your right to vote and our democracy, and will put pressure on the Senate to act. The first bill would establish national election standards by requiring all 50 states to offer at least 2 weeks of early voting, no excuse vote-by-mail options for every voter, a national voter ID standard, and same-day voting registration. Republicans generally oppose the bill.
They also want same-day registration, and that's just very difficult for any election official to manage. And I think that undermines trust in elections.
The second bill would update the 1965 Voting Rights Act and force states with a history of discrimination to clear any potential changes to election laws with the Justice Department. Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says the bill overreaches.
This is a bill to turn the partisan attorney general into a national elections czar.
So with no Republican support, the voting rights legislation can't survive a filibuster vote. That means any debate over voting rights is first going to be about potentially changing Senate rules. The White House says the president today will reiterate support for changing the rules by allowing bills to pass with a simple majority.
I support making an exception on voting rights for the filibuster.
But Albright says the president needs to fight harder.
He's got to give complete, unequivocal support, demand and call for filibuster reform.
So Ed is joining me now from Atlanta with more on this. So Ed, you did a really good job kind of reminding everyone of the two pieces of legislation that have to do with voting rights that have been kind of out there since last year. They pretty much stalled. What more can you tell us about kind of where these bills stand right now? And, we've talked about this before. Once again, President Biden has given himself a self-imposed deadline that he's unlikely to make.
Well, and in this case, the deadline's coming from Senate Democrats who seem to want to try to do this by next Monday, which is an awfully lofty goal given the stakes that they still face. Look, the first bill, named for John Lewis, essentially updates the 1965 Voting Rights Act and goes back to requiring roughly a dozen states to get what they call pre-clearance, or some would say permission, from the Justice Department to make changes to their voting laws because they've had a history of discrimination. That's several states in the South and in the Midwest to some extent who through the years were seen as being discriminatory to different minority groups. The other more ambitious bill, Anne-Marie, one way to describe this thing would be like it's the Build Back Better bill for voting and election law, meaning it's the kitchen soup, the gumbo that has everything in it. It would, among other things, make Election Day a national holiday that most people would have off from work, require all 50 states to offer at least 2 weeks of early voting on nights and weekends for at least 10 hours a day, establish a voter ID requirement that differs from what some states already do, and allow no excuse vote-by-mail options, essentially just the suite of things that in some states Democrats have tried to do. For a variety of reasons, Republicans say this is a no-go. Doesn't mean they don't like some of it. They don't want all of it, however, passed this way. As Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell put it yesterday, in essence, you would take away power from local elections officials, from state elections officials who best understand their communities, the strains that these kinds of rules can put on smaller counties, especially across the country, to offer that amount of service and access when it's not necessarily needed historically. And saying things like, a lot of these changes were made during the pandemic to accommodate millions of people in large urban areas like here in Atlanta or maybe down in Harris County, Houston. but you go to smaller areas of the country where they don't have the manpower to enact and enforce these changes, and you're putting an undue burden on these communities. The other thing they suggest is, look, with that John Lewis Voting Rights Act, a lot of these states, of course, feel they no longer need to be subject to Justice Department rules like this. And as McConnell put it yesterday, again, this is just a counter-argument, you would make a partisan attorney general. They're partisan in the sense that they're appointed by the president in power, in essence, the elections chief of the nation. And he said, what if the shoe were on the other foot? Do you think blue states would have been okay with Bill Barr under Donald Trump having the power to step into a state and change its election laws? That's in essence what this law would allow an attorney general to do. Democrats turn around and say, not quite. Remember, there's been a history of this. These are protections that need to be in place. But either way, for now, the votes don't exist to pass them. So is this just an election year gimmick designed to gin up the base and get them excited ahead of elections, especially here in Georgia, where there's going to be a huge governor's race and a few key congressional races? Or is this a real attempt by the White House to get it done? Time will tell.
Well, it certainly seems like those who have a vested interest in this, voting rights groups, civil rights groups, some of them feel like maybe it is. Maybe it is just sort of a photo op to get everyone excited. In fact, some of those groups are actually skipping the president's speech today because they sort of feel like the Biden administration is not moving fast enough, not doing enough. What are you hearing from them?
Yeah, this is an interesting divide. You're going to see a handful of national civil rights leaders here. Jesse Jackson Jr., for example, Maria Teresa Kumar with Voto Latino, head of the NAACP, Darrell Johnson, who I know you guys have talked to frequently here. They'll be here in town with the president. A handful of congressional Democrats who are big on this issue will be here as well. But several Georgia-based groups have said they're not taking the time today to be here. They think it's a waste of time. They think the president should be giving this speech directly to fellow Democrats in Congress, up at the Capitol today. Go talk to them, they say, and then have them go vote on it. One more day you coming down here to Atlanta is a day wasted where this could have been done. Notably, some members of Dr. King's family, we're here outside Ebenezer Baptist Church where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was once the co-pastor, where the president and vice president will visit later today. Some members of his family say there should be no celebration of MLK Day next Monday unless Congress actually passes this legislation. They've thrown down the gauntlet and said that's how disturbed we are by the lack of action. The argument is if you can put in all this time and energy to getting bridges built, you need to be putting in the same exact kind of energy and strategy to make sure that every American can cast a ballot. So he will run into some of that resistance today, but he will be flanked by national civil rights leaders who say they're with the president in this push. A notable divide and an example of a state that understands as more and more attention is paid to it by Democrats who see the chance to make gains here, that if you're going to keep coming here looking for votes, you got to deliver on promises made.
Well, I think the Build Back Better agenda is a really interesting comparison because, ultimately what was voted on was a much, much skinnier version than what was initially floated. And you got to wonder if this legislation is going to go that way. Ed, we have to wrap it up now, but I hear that we'll be talking to you again in our 9 o'clock hour. So hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit deeper into this topic and other stories coming out of Washington. Ed, thank you very much.
Take care.
The president and vice president are set to deliver remarks from the Atlanta University Center Consortium. That we will bring those remarks to you live, of course. You can watch them at 3:50 Eastern right here on CBSN.